Is everybody ready? Good morning, everyone. This morning I am surrounded by DCI agents. I plan to do two things. Number one is announce further charges in the investigation involving the Department of Revenue, and also generally set forth the framework for a proposal that I'll be making to the legislature called the Government Anti-Corruption Act this upcoming session. Before I begin, I want to make clear with respect to these charges, the two individuals are presumed innocent under the Constitution, but they're very serious charges because they involve public integrity of taxpayer dollars. The other thing that I want to make sure to point out is there are approximately 14,071 state employees. Many of those employees I see every day at the Attorney General's office that are hardworking, they are dedicated, they do their job, and they do it very well. Unfortunately, like any organization, there are situations when people go astray, they do things that are inappropriate, and that is why we are bringing two particular charges. And you've now heard from me as Attorney General on EB5, Gear Up, Department of Social Services revenue, and I think it's time to do something about it. And that doing something about it is bringing criminal charges and proposed legislation. With respect to the criminal charges, indictment has been issued in Hughes County. They involve two individuals. The first one, Lynn Hunsley, was a state employee at the Department of Revenue. She is charged with 7 separate counts. 5 of those counts are felonies. 3 of the 5 are Class 5 felonies, which carry a maximum penalty of 5 years. The other 2 are Class 6 felonies, which carry maximum of 2 years. And then there are a couple of 2 misdemeanors that maximum penalty of 1 year. The gist of those charges deal with a state employee, again with the Department of Revenue, doing their own personal business, taking a situation where allegedly she'd purchased a new vehicle, and in order to avoid some of the excise tax, indicated that there was a trade-in that there was not, and that therefore reduced the tax consequences and liability. The second individual, Danielle Degenstein, is charged with misprision of a felony. It dates back to the situation with Sandra O'Day that had made the false titles in her mother's name. It goes back in time. Because it goes back in time, it was a notary issue. She's alleged to have been the notary on some of those transactions. It's beyond the statute of limitations. There are admittedly other charges that could be brought, but with respect to her, we've charged misprision of a felony because of statements she made to law enforcement. That is our position, allegedly were not accurate. They led us down wrong places. As I indicated, there were other charges that could be brought. You'll probably see some of this information during the legislative process, perhaps during audits. I would consider them minor fractions. To be upfront as Attorney General, if it was a $10 fee waiver and they were honest about it, I didn't bring charges. I felt that is something that the Department of Revenue can handle through their employment process administratively. So those are the bulk of the charges. I would tell you that the governor has been exceptionally cooperative. I met with General Counsel yesterday and discussed these matters. Leadership has been cooperative, but again, there's been some situations where employees have not been straight and forthwith to us. That concerns me as Attorney General because I rely in part upon that information, and I don't want to charge the wrong person or make a mistake. And if we don't receive truthful information, that has resulted in a charge, and that charge is misprision of a felony. With respect to the Government Anti-Corruption Act, I just want to generally state what I'll be doing this session to hopefully address some of these concerns. I want to do it in 4 points. The first point is I'm going to ask for certain mandatory reporting to the Attorney General. That if there's a situation where a supervisor, not just an employee, but a supervisor has credible information of a theft over a set amount, probably $1,000, That would be a mandatory report to the Attorney General or a separate crime. The other is a whistleblower provision. Before, as Attorney General, when EB5 and Gear Up happened, I had sought certain protections, including whistleblower protections. For various reasons, the legislature put some of it in place. It was Senate Bill 27 in 2017. I think, as many of you know, this is important to me because I was asking for these provisions when I wanted to be governor. Those provisions would have affected a Jackley administration. I believe they're good, and I'd like to, again, revisit that with the legislature to put that in place to protect employees when they feel they've seen something inappropriate, to be able to come forth and not have consequences. Through this process, I have personally had people come up to me and talk to me. I've had people talk to our agents about concerns about their job. There are some laws that protect against that, witness tampering and other things, but they're not really geared for it like a whistleblower could protect. The third item I'd like to see are stronger auditor protections. That includes with the elected state auditor. That includes with the Auditor General, which is the protection from the legislative side, and to a degree would involve the treasurer. I plan to work with those entities closer as we get towards session to make sure we put in place stronger auditing in the state. And fourth, transparency. And that transparency should apply also to the Attorney General. As I mentioned, I'm asking for mandatory reporting to the Attorney General. I think the Attorney General, I would be happy to come before the legislature every session and provide a summary of how many reports we received, what we did with those reports, how many we investigated, and how many charges we brought. So in essence, those are the charges, and that is the proposed general framework of the Government Anti-Corruption Act. I'd be happy to answer any questions that I can, recognizing that, again, these two defendants are presumed innocent under the Constitution, and I can't get into full details of the case. That's for later day in court. Yes?
A little unclear if you could go back with Ms. Degenstein, what her involvement was with Ms. O'Day, I guess.
Sure.
I missed that.
So Ms. O'Day has passed away. So I had earlier announced there would not be charges in relation to that incident. The investigation demonstrated allegedly that she had forged or provided false titles of campers that she didn't own, and then took those titles to get bank loans. To do that process, it took a notary. And the allegation against Danielle is she was that notary that did that, and she knew what she was doing. The allegation is not charging her with the notary. The allegation is charging her with misprision of a felony, because when law enforcement came to her to ask her about that, the allegation is she was not forthright and truthful.
What was her motivation for doing that? Do you know?
You'd have to ask her.
Is there any evidence she received any kind of kickback or any kind of?
No evidence of that. Okay. Evidence of knew what she was doing, knew that it was not right, took some action to cover up, including in the investigation interview.
As
Yes.
far as the Anti-Corruption Act and the powers of the auditor and treasurer, South Dakota, many years ago, as you remember, essentially took a lot of the power away from the auditor and treasurer. Are you seeking to give that back? The auditor in particular is a constitutional office, but doesn't have real auditing power. Is that a constitutional change, or how do we do that?
I don't believe it will require a constitutional change. I think the Constitution allows it. You are correct. They did take it away. And I think as we've seen some of this unfold, having a stronger elected auditor, I can't stress that enough. I mean, the importance of an elected office, you answer to the people. And I think that there's things to strengthen it. Access, transparency are part of that. I plan on working with both Rich Satgast, Josh Hader, and Russ Olson to make sure we put in the right provisions that'll be meaningful and will hopefully catch some of this that is going on.
The auditor's website says it's the checks and balances of government. That's not even true, is it?
I don't want to comment regarding a website. What I'll say is this: Vern Larson was the auditor many years ago, several times. He wrote a pretty strong article about the importance of the auditor. I think it talks a little bit about what you mentioned, how there came a point in time where some of the auditor's duties, and maybe less so duties, but resources, went away. And I think it's time the legislature take a look at that. But It shouldn't be in isolation. I name those three positions because I think together they should be that checks and balances. It's the Auditor General that serves at the pleasure of the legislature. It's the state auditor that serves at the pleasure of the voters, and to a lesser degree, but to a degree, the treasurer. And I plan on stating more about it, and hopefully we are able to come to a consensus and provide legislation for the legislature to consider and to strengthen at that point. Yes?
When you're talking about, okay, I want to go back to this situation. You said that the title was used to avoid excise taxes. One thing that's not clear for me on the O'Day situation, what did the taxpayers lose in that case? Was it the banks that lost financially, and can you help me understand?
Both.
How did the state lose taxpayer dollars? The excise tax thing makes sense
Sure.
for Hunsley, but what did O'Day do to?
So you have to look at this scheme went on for many years. I would be upfront. Our investigation typically goes back 7 years because that's the statute of limitations. Now, sometimes I can get into things if it's a theft situation because it's from the point the state knew. And frankly, that's why a mandatory report to the Attorney General is so important, because if people know about it, my statute starts ticking even if I don't know about it. And so, generally speaking, what that scheme was, the allegation is Sandra O'Day would make up camper titles. Part of the reason it's camper titles, and again it's with Hunsley too, is there isn't a national database on this. So there isn't an additional checks and balances. It's just simply the state. So she would make up a title. She would essentially take that title, do the proper notarization, take it to a bank, and there would be a loan. So there is some state funds involved in that process. I would tell you it's primarily bank monies, but I've also been put on notice as Attorney General that the state is going to likely be sued on that issue. And so there's potential civil liability as well as state dollars that were lost with respect to certain transactions.
Okay, so just to be clear, the losses were generally to the banks that were offering these loans based on the fraudulent titles, but the liability financially for the state is maybe more of a potential one on the civil side
Yes.
for allowing that to happen?
Yes.
Okay, gotcha, thank you.
I say potential because I'm defending it, so, yes.
Can you talk a bit about the auditing process? I think a lot of people in the general public think it's like balancing a checkbook where you can tell if money is off, but an audit, a lot of times, is just checking to make sure the process is done correctly without balancing those dollars, and that's why it wasn't caught. Can you kind of explain that in a generalized
Sure.
sense?
So there's different kinds of audits. There's a detailed forensic audit, which of course is the best kind of audit. It's what I like to do as Attorney General because then you can make good decisions from it. There's also what we call spot audits where they'll go in and they'll pick certain items, and that's typically what you're going to see happens. So in South Dakota, we have the Auditor General that does a lot of these audits. It's not necessarily the auditor. It's not the elected state auditor. It's the Auditor General. And so the Auditor General has a team of accountants, and they will come in and they will look at your books. They will look at your policies. And so it's more than just balancing a checkbook. For instance, part of the allegations and concern associated with Department of Revenue is the state was allowing its own employees to do their own personal business, which gave them the opportunity to avoid excise tax or make up own titles. An audit would likely catch that. So the audit would do more than say, the state is missing X number of dollars. There'll be audit findings to say your policies ought to change items 1, 2, and 3. And a good example of that, I think Auditor Russ Olson had issued a general audit with respect to some of these that we're talking about. And I think if you go back to Gear Up and EB5, Marty Ginden, who was the Auditor General before Russ Olson, issued them. And you'll see in the findings, I always say those findings are what would give the boss, whoever's the supervisor, direction on what you should change, on opportunities to strengthen your program so that you don't have losses of taxpayer dollars. But the elected state auditor does not do that. That is the Auditor General.
To be clear, the Auditor General works for the Bureau of Finance and Management. That's how that flows through.
If I were in the legislature, I'd say they work for the legislature, but yeah.
There's a legislative audit, then there's the Bureau of Finance and Management.
Right. in the Bureau, yeah, Bureau of Finance would be under the governor. The legislative audit, because it's legislative, is more under the legislature. They have to work together. I mean, you don't want to duplicate, but in order to have checks and balances, you have to have some separation.
The executive branch watching the executive branch and the legislature watching the legislature. That's what that is now, basically.
Yes, but that doesn't concern me as much, because understand the Attorney General is the executive branch. I investigate the executive branch. I investigate the legislative branch. I investigate the judicial branch.
But you are an elected individual.
I answer to the
official.
people, yes.
With the executive branch, they report to the governor.
Correct. And that's why I stress, right now, I think there needs to be more reliance on the elected state auditor. And I support that as Attorney General.
Can you talk a bit more about the whistleblower provision and how that would work for an employee?
Sure. So if you go back and look at, it was my Senate Bill 27 in 2017. It primarily, in that period, it was focused on public officials. What I'd like to see is a true whistleblower, which is essentially anytime a state employee goes to a supervisor, goes to law enforcement, frankly goes to another fellow employee who then takes it the next step, there are legal protections that their bosses can't fire them, can't demote them, can't take adverse employment action against them because they're doing the right thing.
Should there be some monetary, in the federal whistleblower, if a whistleblower exposes a Medicare fraud, they get a percentage of that. It's meant as a protection because you still gotta go back into the workplace. In here, it's even worse, right? You still gotta go to the grocery store.
Yeah, there is a financial incentive for that. I recognize this likely could be a tough budget year. So I do not anticipate proposing that. Obviously, if the legislature would like to do that, I wouldn't oppose it. I'd consider that a friendly amendment. But I do not anticipate seeking that, because I have every belief this legislative session, it's time to tighten the belts.
One more question
Yep.
on the whistleblower deal. We're talking about protections for whistleblowers who identify potential criminal activity, or does it go beyond that?
I'd like to see it go beyond that.
Okay, so for ethical violations, and again, you'd report on that to the legislature as well.
It depends upon how it's ultimately going to be worded. There is a conversation about looking at amounts, and so that's more on the dollar value. In other words, if it's under $1,000, typically in South Dakota, we consider that misdemeanor activity. If it's over $1,000, we generally consider that tiered felony activity. That'll have to be the conversation. I just want some additional protections.
How would that whistleblower actually be protected? If I, as a whistleblower, go to my supervisor, how do I know I'm not going to be retaliated against and feel safe in reporting this?
You have additional legal protections. Some of those legal protections kick in the ability for the Attorney General to step in and do some things. Right now, depending upon the circumstance, I do not have that ability. I can bring a witness tampering, but in order to bring a witness tampering, I've got to have either anticipated litigation or actual litigation. If I'm just in the investigative stage, it's just not as good a statute as a whistleblower protection. And certainly, if you look at other states, they go well beyond with additional civil, they have incentives. I'm just proposing strengthening a bare bones whistleblower so that if there's a state employee that knows about a fellow employee doing something inappropriate, they're comfortable coming to me, the Attorney General, and saying, there's a problem here. And then we take it from there, but there'll be no adverse consequences to that employee.
Do you think that you're gonna have after Gear Up and EB-5, those were huge controversies, and Senate Bill 27 didn't get everything you wanted?
It got very little that I wanted. It got something, and I appreciate that,
Yeah.
but it
what's
needs to be
different today?
strengthened.
What's different today? Do you think you have a more friendly legislature? Is it the cumulative effect of all these things?
I think number one, it's the public support. As I travel around the state, people want their taxpayer dollars protected. Number two, there is a different group and peer that I think it'll be more well-received. It was an uphill battle. I mean, I'm sure Lance Russell would talk about, he was chair of judiciary, and it was a battle to get in what we could get in. And we had to give away way more than we should have, but to get something passed. And you shouldn't have to do that.
Why?
You know, you and the media should ask those questions. It would be political at that point, and that's not appropriate for me to get into here. But what I would also say, in addition to that, it is that cumulative effect. I mean, you've heard me say this before. My job as Attorney General is primarily to step in as an enforcement when the bank is robbed. It's time to take steps to make sure the bank isn't robbed. And I think the role of that is mandatory reporting to the Attorney General, whistleblower protections, stronger auditing, and then a level of transparency. And I'm willing to have that transparency be on the Attorney General also. Like when I was running for governor, willing to do it in 2017 on a position I was asking for. I think it's the right thing to do for the people of South Dakota.
Can you outline that as far as what transparency would look like in this kind of bill? Like when you say a level of transparency?
So transparency would be in a couple buckets. One would be on the enforcement. That's easy for me to say, I'm willing to do it, so put that requirement on me. So that bucket would be number of reports I get, number of investigations. Perhaps you could even include on the whistleblower side, depending upon what the legislature would determine the role of the Attorney General is. So that bucket is there. The other level of transparency deals with the auditing side. I think that's a huge level of transparency. And I think that will be part of what you see from the auditing provisions with the elected state auditor, the Auditor General, and the elected state treasurer.
Any other questions?
I did have one more follow-up, just going back to the, or I guess regarding Hunsley's crime. Was there a specific date, I'm not sure if I missed it, a specific date where these crimes took place that she's charged with?
January 21 through June 23, roughly.
Of this year?
Yes.
Just
June 1 of 2023.
2023?
Yep. The charges just came out yesterday, so that just happened.
I just wanted to ask before Tony gets the hook and pulls you out of here. Is there a
I think
copy
that's
of this
coming.
legislation out there? Someone did you say that?
No, these are the general guide frames, the framework. We are putting that together. I am working with legislators to try to get improvements, suggestions, and going to be working closely with the state auditor, the state treasurer, and the Auditor General. And I would tell you, some of the auditor issues may be one of resources. To do a spot audit, which is really what you're looking at, I mean, there can be some forensic audits. That takes auditors, and there'll have to be a decision made as to whether that's a wise use of taxpayer dollars. I feel within reason it is. We already have an Auditor General, and we already have a state auditor and a treasurer. I think a little bit of additional resources would go a long ways. Any other last questions?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you've got questions, call me. Once the indictments are officially with the seal on it, we'll get them to you.